first scripture reading is from the book of Amos, chapter 6, verses 1a, and then verses 4 to 7. What sorrow awaits you who lounge in luxury in Jerusalem, and you who feel secure in Samaria? How terrible for you who sprawl on ivory beds and lounge on your couches, eating the meat of tender lambs from the flock, and of choice calves fattened in the stall. You sing trivial songs to the sound of the harp and fancy yourselves to be great musicians like David. You drink wine by the bowlful and perfume yourselves with fragrant lotions. You care nothing about the ruin of your nation. Therefore, you will be the first to be led away as captives. Suddenly, all your parties will end. Next is the reading from the book of Luke, chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. Jesus said, "There was a certain rich man who was splendidly clothed in purple and fine linen, and who lived each day in luxury. At his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, who was covered with sores. As Lazarus lay there, longing for scraps from the rich man's table, the dogs would come and lick his open sores. Finally, the poor man died and was carried by the angels to sit beside Abraham at the heavenly banquet. The rich man also died and was buried, and he went to the place of the dead. There in torment he saw Abraham in the far distance with Lazarus at his side. The rich man shouted, 'Father Abraham, have some pity. Send Lazarus over here to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. I am in anguish in these flames.' But Abraham said to him, 'Son, remember that during your lifetime you had everything you wanted and Lazarus had nothing. So now he is here being comforted and you are in anguish. And besides, there is a great chasm separating us. No one can cross over to you from here, and no one can cross over to us from there.' Then the rich man said, 'Please, Father Abraham, at least send him to my father's home. For I have 5 brothers, and I want him to warn them so they don't end up in this place of torment.' But Abraham said, 'Moses and the prophets have warned them. Your brothers can read what they wrote.' The rich man replied, 'No, Father Abraham, but if someone is sent to them from the dead, then they will repent of their sins and turn to God.' But Abraham said, 'If they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be persuaded even if someone raises from the dead.'" May God add his blessing to the reading of his word.
So our reading this morning is a parable, a story that Jesus tells, and I think it begins rather interestingly. There was a certain rich man. Now, actually, we recently, if it wasn't just last week, I think, read a story that began almost the same. There was a certain rich man who had a manager. This morning, we're talking about the actual rich man, not the manager. But is it the same rich man? Doesn't really matter. It's this whole, there was a certain rich man. And when we read that, we have our own ideas and our own concepts of what that means. But it's important to begin by looking at what first, Jesus' audience would see and what Luke's audience would have seen, and then we can come back to ourselves. Now, Jesus actually tells us in the story some of this setting. Jesus paints a picture for us of this rich man. He has extravagant clothing. We may not catch it in the descriptions of the clothing, but if you were to study the history of the time and compare the things that we know about their culture and about that time and about what it takes to make the kind of clothing that are being described, that's very rich clothing. As a matter of fact, the clothing that the rich man is wearing that Jesus describes probably would require a year or maybe several years' wages of a day laborer to pay for. So this man had a very extravagant wardrobe. One of the commentaries I read said that the underclothes that it describes, that are the nice white cotton, does it say wool, white cotton wool? Fine linen. Is that the underclothes? The process to make those is very labor intensive, so it makes them quite expensive. But then on top of that, just in case, if you have those kinds of clothes, everyone knows that you have means, right? But there's still some modesty in wearing white, apparently. But he doesn't stop there. On top of that, he wears a purple robe, right? And purple, the color of kings. The reason we consider purple to be the color of kings is because in ancient times, the process to create purple dye was extremely expensive. And so that made his clothes quite expensive. Then it talks about the food, and it says that he feasts regularly. And the impression that we get here is from the idea of putting on special dinners that involve guests, and we've talked a little bit about what those kinds of meals might look like, symposiums. But what Jesus wants us to see, wants his audience to see, is that this man has more than enough. He has well more than what he requires or needs to be able to survive or to be able to live a good life even. One of the things I read talked about how there's a sort of a history of how one of the King Herods would put on a banquet like every day kind of thing. And this is like extreme wealth to be able to do something like that. You think of the story of the lost son, the prodigal son who comes back, and his father kills a special calf that they'd been keeping just for a big party, right? And this calf would feed a large party of guests. But that's something they only did on a very special occasion. Well, what then does it look like when when somebody does this regularly? Jesus wants us to be sure that we understand that the picture of the rich man he's painting is not just any rich man. This is the 1%, right? And then he talks about Lazarus being outside his gate. So in case we weren't sure, this rich man is a landowner with an estate and a home, whether it's the country home or the city home, that has its own walls and its own gates. And this man there's no doubt what rich means. I want you to also remember that when Jesus is speaking to his immediate audience, all he has to say is there was a certain rich man, and he's already, all that other stuff is window dressing. All of the people in Jesus' audience who aren't rich, which is the bulk of his audience, right? They're the poor, they work on farms, they are mostly subsistence people, they're poor. And they would see this rich man and they would know that he's an evil man in their eyes. And I've mentioned this before, they live in a society where they believe that there's only so much to go around. There is no such thing as the Great American Dream. And if there was such a thing as the Great American Dream, those would be evil people. That would be an evil dream. Because to become rich, to be a self-made millionaire, is to take from everybody else. And of course, it's the poor who lose the most, right? So in a society like Jesus, to just stand up and start to tell a story about a rich man, that's a cue to the audience. So everyone who's poor sees the rich man as someone who has his benefit on the backs of the poor. And quite possibly, or even probably, the rich people in Jesus' audience, and there would have been some, maybe not as rich as this man, because why would they go out into the fields or wherever to listen to Jesus? But there would have been some in his audience that had more means than the poor. And remember, in Jesus' audience, there's rich and there's poor. There's no such thing as middle class per se. The gap is big. There's not what we see as middle class. But if you were listening to Jesus' message and you had wealth, you had property, Maybe you didn't, have the kind of wealth that this guy has, or you at least don't flaunt it the way he does. There's a couple of ways you might react. You might react thinking that Jesus is off base because obviously the Old Testament teaches that God blesses the ones that he loves, right? So if you have something, that means you've been blessed by God. That means God must love you, therefore you can't be bad. A different dynamic going on that justifies their place in life. Now, in Luke, Jesus has previously said to his disciples, beware of the Pharisees and their love of money. It makes it sound like the Pharisees are rich, but that doesn't fit with the historical picture, which says that most of the Pharisees are tradespeople. So the bulk of the Pharisaical sect are tradespeople. They would have been like Jesus, carpenters, builders, smiths maybe, I don't know, whatever the trades are in the Jewish culture at that time. And tradespeople would have fit an interesting socioeconomic niche in their society, because when things are really good, i.e. a good economy, they probably are doing better than the guy who farms for food, basically, who works on a farm and gets paid, in food or whatever. They might be doing better than that person in a good economy. But in lean times, when there are famines and things, the people who have money, the people who have food and land, the rich people, would not be paying the tradesmen for new things because they're saving their money because it's a lean time and they don't know how long that's going to last. And basically, lean time isn't because, somebody bought too many of one kind of shares. It's because the crops didn't grow. The fishing wasn't good. This economy is tied entirely and is about food, right? So a lot of those Pharisees, I don't know where they would fall in Jesus' speech. I don't think most of them would be considered rich. Few of them, I think, would be considered rich. Now, some of them, the leaders, the teachers, the ones that were special, would be the friends of rich people. You notice how Jesus gets invited to a lot of dinners by Pharisees and other people like that? It's because he's notable. He's building up honor, and so it brings honor to the person who invites him as a guest to their special dinner, right? And so some of these Pharisees would be friends of those kinds of people. There might be a few in the audience who can afford to throw dinners and once in a while have special people. But the Pharisees, a lot of them would be in a sort of they're closer to the poor end, or they are poor, depending on how the crops are going and stuff. So it would not necessarily be right to think of the Pharisees listening to Jesus' story thinking that he's talking about them when he talks about a rich man, especially when he draws this picture of the kind of rich man he's talking about. There may be nobody in the audience that would identify that they're that guy, right? But it's possible, and Luke would give us, the other Gospels not necessarily as much, but Luke would give us the impression to some degree that he would see the Pharisees at least of wanting or wishing that they could be that very rich man. And again, to them, they may not see it the way that the poor people see it, as in robbing from the poor people, but they might see it as God blessing them. But whichever way it is, there's a divide here between the rich and the poor, and Jesus' audience would automatically identify it. So we have the rich man, and then we have Lazarus. Lazarus is not a rich man. Lazarus is not a middle-class man. Lazarus is not a working poor. Lazarus is down and out. Lazarus is destitute. Lazarus is laying by the rich man's gate, which means he might even be crippled or something. Lazarus begs for a living, and he longs for the scraps from the rich man's table. Longs for kind of suggests he doesn't get them, right? So he's starving outside this rich man's home and gets nothing. He's probably ill. He's definitely an outcast because he has sores all over his body, which makes him unclean. And nobody who wants to stay clean can touch him or help him. Think about that. Helping, being a nurse, being a caregiver in Jesus' society would make you unclean. That's not a great job, right? It means that you are lowered to the level of the people you are helping to some degree. And he's tormented by the stray dogs. It says the dogs came and licked his sores. They didn't come and lick his sores to make him feel better. These are the dogs that are out, trying to get scraps of food themselves. And that's probably more like torture than anything else. And, of course, dogs are not considered clean either. So I've already talked a little bit about the context of the rich versus poor in Jesus' time and to Jesus' audience. But then there's Luke's audience, which takes place not that much long afterwards, but it takes place primarily in the early church. So we already have groups of Christians who are meeting together, who are sharing the stories of Jesus, who are trying to learn what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And they're receiving Luke's gospel. And in these groups, we know from Paul's letters that there are rich people and there are poor people. There are slaves and there are slave owners. There are men and women. There are people from every walk of life. There are foreigners. There are Gentiles. There's all kinds of people in the early church across the Roman Empire. And so when Luke writes his gospel, he's aware that they're hearing these stories as well. And it's up to us to think a little bit about how has Luke framed the story to make sure that his audience receives it in a particular way. Again, there's still no middle class, so the rich and the poor are still a fairly big divide. But what does a church sitting listening to someone reading from Luke's gospel this story of Jesus? This is the story Jesus told, right? This is fresh. This isn't 2,000 years removed. This is like within a generation of Jesus' time on earth. There may be people in the audience that either knew Jesus or know some of his disciples, or something like that. That's how close this is to the story. And there's a fellow sitting over here who has some nice clothes, meaning he owns some property, he has some land, he has some wealth. He's a rich man. There's somebody sitting over here who's wearing rags, and they're a slave. There's a fellow over there who has good clothes. They're not rich people's clothes, but they're a slave. But that's because they work for someone who has money. And then there's that woman and her children over there who have rags and nothing because she's a widow and has no one to take care of her and relies on this church that she's meeting with to help her out. That's the diversity of the group of the early church that's listening to the story that describes what? It describes horrendous wealth in the presence of horrendous suffering and destitution. So it's a contrast which should make Luke's audience uncomfortable and which should hopefully make those Jesus followers who have means be more aware of the needs of their fellow brothers and sisters. Well, what does rich and poor mean in our context? Well, it depends on individuals. We live in a really complex world, and we all have varying different ideas and feels about what we have different outlooks on life. And so our idea of what rich means probably has a lot to do with where we are on that socioeconomic scale. And we live in a society which somewhat still has a range right from the poorest poor to the unbelievable rich. And I'm not sure who we would equate in this story to the rich man, but I'm sure we wouldn't have trouble finding stories in our news and on the internet about people who have extravagant clothing and big houses and have parties lots. That wouldn't be very hard. But are they the only rich people in our world? Do we only see the 1% as the rich? Certainly the man that Jesus describes really describes well the 1%, or maybe even the 10%, if that's the other number. People who make more money and have more wealth than they ever could spend for their needs. Now, you got to be careful how you say that, right? It's how they could spend for their needs. You can, no matter how much money you get, you can spend it, but it would be wasting, right? And that's the point. What does all this wealth do for someone like that? So even we live in a world like that, and we live in a world where it's difficult to decide what counts as rich, right? Because in our world, there are still those who are in a position similar to Lazarus. There are street people. They're sick. They have lots of issues, health issues. Living on the street shortens your life. And most of them, or not most of them, but a lot of them are on the street because of some health issue, a mental health issue, a physical health issue that makes it hard for them to work or to hold a job. It makes it hard for them to function in our society. And that drives them to the margins, and it increases or magnifies their situation. A certain rich man, he had privilege, he had food security, he had adequate shelter, and he had suitable clothing. If we describe the rich man in those terms, I think most of us get to fall into that category, right? And the reason I would use those terms and ask you this morning to try to see the story in those terms, food security means you don't worry day to day about whether or not you're going to be able to have a meal. Adequate shelter means that you know where you're going to sleep tonight. Suitable clothing. When the snow comes and the weather or the temperature drops, you know where to find a pair of gloves and a hat and some boots to keep your feet dry and warm. These are luxuries compared to what a lot of people in our own city live with. They come to our food bank because they don't know if the food's going to make it through the week. They go to places like Salvation Army and stuff to buy some extra clothes when the weather gets bad, if they can scrape together the money. Or they go to one of the places that gives out free clothing, if they can find something that works there. A lot of them don't have shelter. Or some of them, the reason they're at the food bank and they're buying dollar clothes is because all of the money they get goes towards shelter, and it isn't the nicest shelter either. And it may not guarantee that they'll be warm, just that they're out of the weather. The problem sometimes when we start to look at these stories and these kinds of pictures, of course, is it does no good to feel guilty. That doesn't, well, it can motivate. Guilt can motivate, it certainly can. But I don't believe it's the motivation that Jesus would have his followers motivated by. So, there's a turn in our story. We've described a rich man and a poor man. They're divided by a gate. They're divided by a chasm in their lifestyles and in where their lot in life has put them. And let's just not forget that, right? The rich man isn't rich because God blessed him. He isn't rich because he worked hard. He's rich because he had an inheritance. He's rich because he benefited from things that other people did and other people had. And to some degree, the view of limited good, it isn't all-encompassing, but it still has some reality to it. No one accomplishes anything without the efforts of other people. The fact that any of us can get a job is because other people built an economy. It's because other people are working, other people are buying, other people are doing things. It's because we have land that we didn't really earn and we didn't make. We just, lots of us who have this, light-colored skin came and took. Or if we're generations later, as we all are, we benefited from other white people who took it. So, to be clear, the blessings that the rich man enjoyed weren't necessarily singled out, weren't likely given because of his merit. And we live in a broken world, and that's just the way it is. And that's a whole other conversation about where, does God bless only the good people? Does God allow rain to fall on only the bad people? We know that's not true. But in this story, there's a turn. They die. Both of them die. Well, Lazarus probably died sooner. Unless, of course, the rich man had way too many parties and then they both died. But there's a great reversal in death. Now, in our psalm, we read, everyone dies, right? We know that. And no matter how rich you are, how powerful you are, when you're dead, that's gone. Someone else gets it. Someone else does something with it. Someone else decides what happens with your legacy. But there's a great reversal in Jesus' story, and it fits Jesus' ministry, right? So the rich man ends up in Hades, is the Greek that it would have referred to in our text. It said the land of the dead, which is a good translation of what Hades would have meant to the Greek audience that this gospel was written to. It was written in Greek, so anybody reading Greek would know that Hades refers to the land of the dead. That's a general term. It could mean a lot of things to different audiences. It would bring to mind for Jewish audiences an area outside of Jerusalem which is basically a garbage dump, right? So when you read things about Hades, where the place of death, or whatever term is being used, where the fires burn and unceasingly, and worms eat things, and all these horrible descriptions. Well, that's an actual place outside of Jerusalem during the time that this is written, or the time that Jesus tells the story. There's a physical place that fits that description. Obviously, that's not what Jesus is describing. Jesus is describing something like the afterlife. But I don't believe that this story is a description of the afterlife. Remember, this is a story. It's a parable. And so we've no more reason to try to fit this rich man to a particular individual than we have to try to see his plight as being a specific description of what happens in death. But Jesus does want us to know that death can be the great leveler or the great reversal. And Jesus talks about his kingdom being the upside down kingdom. And he talks about things being turned upside down. So the rich man ends up in a place of torment, is kind of what's described. As a matter of fact, I think the rich man describes himself as being tormented. And where does Lazarus go? Lazarus goes to the bosom of Abraham, and at a feast yet. Now, the bosom of Abraham at a feast suggests the image of they're lying down, which is what that culture does, to eat, and Abraham is in the first place of honor right next to or not Abraham, Lazarus right next to Abraham. That's amazing. So Abraham goes from the lowest possible position in his life to what the Jesus audience would see as the highest possible position in the afterlife. Abraham, the father of their nation, the great patriarch, sitting next to him at the table of a banquet. That's great. And the rich man, who, by the way, never gets a name in this story, right? That's important. He's just a rich man. He goes to a place where he begs for water, a drop of water on his tongue. So it must not be a very nice place. But he's separated, right? He doesn't get what he wants. He's separated by a great gulf. And Abraham doesn't cooperate. But I want to point out this reversal. Jesus teaches over and over again, the first will be last and the last will be first. In Luke 1:43, he says, he has filled the hungry with good things. Actually, we believe this is Mary who has written this. It's called Mary's Magnificat. And she's talking about the blessing of the baby that she's about to bear, which is Jesus. And she's foretelling something. And she says, he has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away with empty hands. And then in Luke 6:21, Jesus says, God blesses you who are hungry now, for you will be satisfied. So we shouldn't be surprised when we see what happens with Lazarus in Jesus' story. It fits what he's been teaching all along. Later in the same section, he says, what sorrows await you who are rich, for you have your only happiness now. What sorrow awaits you who are fat and prosperous now, for a time of awful hunger awaits you. This is exactly what Abraham says to the rich man when he says, can you send Lazarus over with a drop of water? And Abraham says, you had your turn, right? You had wealth, you had pleasure, you had all those good things. Now you get to do without. Lazarus had nothing, and now he gets to have them. This is the reversal that Jesus talks about. And then in those two passages I just read are from Luke's version of the Beatitudes, but in Matthew's version he says, God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And I just wanted to throw that one in because that's the story that Jesus is telling his audience. The rich man had lots of opportunity to show mercy to Lazarus. He knows Lazarus' name, so apparently he must have been aware of him in life, as far as the story is concerned, right? But he did nothing to help him. There is food that was wasted from his table, and he wouldn't even send it to the gate for Lazarus that he knew about, and he couldn't be bothered. And in death, in his suffering, he asks that Lazarus perform him an act of mercy. And Jesus' words in Matthew would be, well, if you had shown some, maybe you would receive some. I guess I want to pause there to say that I don't believe the afterlife looks like that. In the sense that the audience to whom Jesus is speaking, he wants to send a particular message, and it isn't about the afterlife. He wants the poor in his audience to know, and this is about the afterlife in this sense. It isn't a physical description, but he wants the poor to know that God's love is such that they will not suffer forever. If nothing else, after death, God will take care of them. They will receive the blessings they didn't receive in life. That's a promise. So in Jesus' story, there's a promise for people who are suffering. Whatever that suffering may be, there's a promise of healing. There's a promise of fulfillment. There's a promise of blessing. And there's a warning to the rich man, or to people that might be like him. The warning is, show mercy if you want to receive mercy from the Almighty. Now, I'm not saying I believe God works in a way that he keeps a tally and he punishes people for every good deed they didn't do, and so on and so forth. But Jesus wants to make sure that his audience knows, and that audience includes us, that we are expected to do good with all that we've received. We talked about this last week, I believe, or the week before, and we continue in the same vein, and this is a continuation of Jesus' teaching. And what is Jesus trying to teach us about wealth, and what's he trying to teach us about the things that we have? I believe over and over again he tries to teach us that we're supposed to spend them on helping others, right? So what does that look like? What does this say to us? How do we use our wealth? Do we have wealth? Well, if we use that definition that I used earlier, food security, adequate shelter, adequate clothing, we have that kind of wealth, right? Some of us more than others. How do we use it? Are we showing mercy to those outside our gates? The rich man in the story didn't, right? But what is outside our gates? Well, there's outside our gates in our neighborhood, right? This church, as a group, has a food bank, which shows mercy to the people outside our door in this neighborhood, in our city, in our immediate neighborhood. There are individuals in this church who help the food bank with their money. There are individuals who give food to the food bank. There are individuals who volunteer at the food bank. There's an individual sitting here this morning who keeps it running and organizes the people that will help out there. Thank you, Joanna. And keeps that dream alive. So yes, we do that in at least that way. And I'm sure that there are individuals in our family that help others that we don't see, that do things, support other mission work or other charities in our city, and we may never know about, that help friends or people that they see or know or hear about in ways, again, that we will never know about. Do we help people outside our gates in our country? There are people in our country who don't have clean water, who haven't had it for years. That's just not right. In a country that has more fresh water than any other place in the world, I don't see how we can justify that. There are children who don't get the same level of education as the average, and it's simply because of the way we do things. There are people who don't have adequate housing or clothing, and it would be easy if we tried to blame it on them. But read Jesus' stories, and I don't think you will ever see him talking about someone being poor and then talking about they did it to be that way. There's a story where a man is blind and his disciples ask him, well, why is he blind? Is it something he did or something his parents did? And Jesus says, it isn't something anybody did. This is an opportunity for God to show blessing. Well, if the poor or the blind or the lame in our society or our country are there for God to show blessing, then they're there for his church to bless. Because how does Jesus' name get lifted up unless the people who call themselves by his name bless those people who need mercy the most? What about outside of the gates of our country? How do we treat immigrants? How do we treat people who are running from situations of death in their own countries? How do we treat people who are just coming here because they want a better life? They want a freer life instead of the one that they might be leaving behind. Do we show mercy? That is what Jesus wants us to do, I believe. So this is where it gets a little tricky. Well, maybe it got tricky a little while ago. But one of the challenges of preparing messages or preaching or sermons, whatever word you want to use, and this is going to come across like a sermon, is that, quite honestly, there are weeks where I have bright ideas, and maybe that came from me, but there are lots of weeks where I know God is saying I have to say something. I may not do the best job of it, but I'm doing my best to be true to what God says to me. And one of the things that I believe I have to try to do when I'm up here talking to you is be current or connect what we're learning and reading about with the world around us. And obviously, to me, the most obvious connection is there are elections coming up, right? There are parties and representatives who want our votes. And how will we use them? We have a wealth. This is a wealth. If we look at our world, the ability to vote is a type of riches. And if we don't vote, what are we doing? We're wasting it. So how do we vote? Will we put our trust in those people who want to maintain the status quo? Will we vote for the people who safeguard our wealth and our privilege? That's a tough one, right? Because we've been trained by our family, our society, our jobs, everything, that voting should be about creating a better economy or a better workplace or a better, there's always some agenda which fits my agenda, right? Even Christian agendas are often more about my Christian agenda than necessarily Jesus' agenda. And I think our story is supposed to tell us that Jesus' agenda is about mercy. So do we support those who fight for mercy, for the poor, the weak, and the outcast? Will that cost us something if we do that? If I vote for somebody who says they're going to take care of the poor, if I vote for somebody who says they're going to make sure everybody in this country gets a good education and water and that every child is fed, that's going to cost me something because there are taxes needed to pay for those kind of things. But here's the question. Even if I'm willing to do that, is there anyone like that I can vote for? And I bet if I asked everybody here to name who they think would be able to do that, we'll have a lot of different names. Because that's our politics. It sucks. And this person promises this thing and that person promises that thing, and they both have something that's going to help someone, but they also have other things going to hurt someone. And that's because we live in a kind of world where it's hard to balance the good. Here's the good news. It comes from our psalm this morning. The psalmist reminded us not to put our trust in powerful people. They will die, and their plans will die with them. So does that mean that we don't vote? No. It means that we do our best. Be joyful. Joyful are those who have God as their helper, and whose hope is in the Lord. So what are we called to do? We're called to show mercy. So in my own personal life, in my own walk, when I encounter situations that need mercy, that's my responsibility. And if I listen to Jesus, he will tell me what to do. He will point out to me the areas in which I need to be merciful. And you know what? Here's the rub. As a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, the more I follow, the more I listen, the harder it gets. Maturity sucks. It really does. Because the more we become in line with Jesus' calling for us, the more mature we become as Christians, the more we see that we still need to grow. We do not get to retire as Jesus followers. The Spirit of God compels us to always be growing in Jesus. We are blessed along the way. And you know what? I believe Jesus gives us times to rest. He lets us say, okay, he says to us, well done, good servant. You've accomplished this change in your life. You've grown this new milestone in your life. You get to take a small break. But if we are still listening, there's still work to be done. And he will come back with either that still silent voice, or sometimes it's a real good kick in the backside and says, okay, time to get up and get going. There's something new. Or someone will say something and it'll rile us up and we'll think, no, that's wrong. And then if we're having that conversation with God about everything, about all of our ideas, about all of our worldviews, if we're having an honest conversation with God and God wants us to change our mind, have the conversation about all those things that make you uncomfortable. And if God's in it, you'll stay uncomfortable. He will continue to talk to you about it. But here's the thing. We do our best to show mercy in our lives. We work for a country and a world that will show mercy. So all we can do is our best in our choices. But please, as you prepare for the election, 2 things I implore you. Vote. You must vote first for anything to change. And secondly, invest some time in looking at the people that you want to vote for and deciding, will they bring mercy the way Jesus would bring mercy? That's what I'm asking. And then finally, at the end of the day, we have to put our trust that God can use the limited efforts, flawed and limited efforts that we make. That's the promise. That's the promise. We don't put our trust in those systems. We live our best as we can within them. Sometimes we are called to change them, and we must be brave enough to do that when those times come. But whatever it is that we're called to in our world, whoever we decide to vote for, whichever person or party we think will best serve Christ's kingdom coming, we still at the end of the day have to trust God, because the best of people in power fail. Only God and only God's grace will bring about a better world at the end of the day, or at the end of the age, as Jesus would say. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, it's a little easier when we look at this story and when we look at the big picture of how complicated and messed up our world and our country is. Maybe it's a little easier to see what we can do in our own personal lives to show mercy to others. At least maybe it's a little easier to see it. But where it is foggy, where it's difficult or challenging, we pray for your wisdom. Lord, I pray for your strong, clear voice to teach us more mercy, more love in our own personal lives. And then beyond that, Jesus, we need so much mercy and support and wisdom to know how to act in a complicated, confusing, broken world. How to act in ways that will bring justice and peace to the world around us. That will bring the kind of mercy that you want to show. I don't think we can do that if we're not first filled with your love, Jesus. So again, just fill us with your unconditional, unbelievable love, and help us to turn that towards the world around us. Give us wisdom and courage, we pray, Lord, to do the things you do show us. We will need wisdom to see where you are at work and how to join you, and we will need courage to change our minds, to change our hearts, to change our actions. And we'll need courage and strength to stay the course. We are small, frail beings, and we will die just like the people in the story. But while we're here, give us strength to show your love and your mercy we pray.